Clarissa Ward, Chief International Correspondent for CNN. Thank you for joining me via النهار platform. Clarissa, you have covered a lot of conflicts. What is the difference when you report from the Middle East?
I always think it's very difficult to compare conflicts. Every single conflict is different. And even the idea of the Middle East to me is a little bit misguiding because my work in Iraq has been so different to my work in Syria, which has been so different to my work in Yemen, which has been so different to my work in Gaza. And so I think it's difficult to generalize about the Middle East and to make assumptions about the entire region or try to categorize the different conflicts that have taken place there. But I will say that I've spent a lot of my career there. I've learned a lot about how to cover conflict on the ground in many different Middle Eastern countries. And it's been a hugely important part of helping me to better understand what it takes to be a good conflict journalist.
Yes. Clarissa, how would you describe your coverage for Gaza War? What did you learn?
I think this has been one of the most challenging and humbling experiences of my life, trying to cover Gaza. And there's so many different reasons for that. But the big one is that we can't be on the ground. We can't get in. We don't have access. I can't walk through the streets. I can't talk to the people. I can't sit in their homes, even putting aside, of course, the security piece of that. I can't do it because I'm not allowed on the ground. Our team managed to get in once for a matter of hours. That is not enough to do justice to the scale of the atrocities and the horrors of what is going on in Gaza. It's also made our job really difficult because every day I have to sift through all this information, all of these pictures, try to choose the story that makes sense for that day or for that week, try to build up a better picture of exactly what happened. People's phones, as you know, are not working half the time. We are in the midst of an information war that is being fought as well. And when you're not on the ground and you don't have the authority of being able to say, excuse me, I saw it with my own eyes, it makes it so much more difficult to speak with the kind of moral clarity that we really need to hear right now. Obviously, there are incredibly courageous journalists on the ground in Gaza who have been doing God's work. And so many of us have been blown away by their determination and by their grit and by their tenacity and their bravery. But in an ideal world, of course, their efforts should be supplemented with the efforts of international journalists, international aid workers, international human rights organizations who can help build up a fuller picture of what is happening on the ground and to speak with declarative authority about what is happening.
You entered actually Gaza not as embedded journalist. Could you tell me about your observations regarding the humanitarian crisis there?
I knew it was going to be bad. I knew it was going to be as challenging as anything I've seen in my career. And walking around the field hospital where we spent a few hours and seeing children who have been orphaned, who have been maimed, speaking to a young woman who lost her leg, whose dreams were shattered, it has a very sobering and honestly a heartbreaking effect on any human being. Because you realize that when we talk about the numbers in Gaza, we talk about 30,000 people, almost 30,000 people now dead, you lose something in that of the humanity, of the individuals. These aren't 30,000 generic people. These are individuals with hopes and dreams. These are people who loved and who were loved. And in my reporting, in my coverage of war in general, I have always sought to humanize the victims of war, to humanize the civilians who suffer. And really that short amount of time that we had in the hospital was so hugely important for me. It was so painful to witness, but so hugely important because A, it gave me the opportunity to say, I've seen it with my own eyes. We were there in that hospital for 5 minutes and a bomb dropped nearby. Now, the Israelis knew that we were there. They knew that we were there. And still, that bomb was dropped, and 5 minutes after that, casualties were brought in. A 13-year-old boy with his foot hanging off, an older man who had lost half his leg. And so it was a hugely valuable experience. I think we did a good job telling the story of our trip into Gaza, but at the same time, it's not enough. We need to be on the ground all the time. And that's why I have written letters to the governments of Israel and Egypt. I have published an editorial opinion piece with the Washington Post. And I know that many of my colleagues feel the same way I do, that we must be allowed on the ground to do our jobs properly.
And here, Clarissa, you admit that journalists have to play a role in shedding light concerning the humanitarian crisis within zone conflicts.
I think that's a huge part of what we do. We bear witness. We shine a light on a situation where maybe most people can't get in or most people are not aware of what is happening. We challenge people in positions of power and hold them accountable for their actions. These are the ideals that we aspire to as journalists. We don't always get it perfectly right. But in this case, we don't even have the opportunity to get it wrong because we're not in the position on the ground to do our jobs properly. Now, don't get me wrong. There are other ways to tell this story, and we are telling them. Last month, I had a big investigation into civilians in Gaza carrying white flags who were killed in what appear to be, on the surface, war crimes. These types of investigative stories, using footage from social media and on the ground, are labors of love. They take a lot of work to piece together. You have to go through and geolocate the video. You have to then find other videos or satellite imagery that will show you where the person was in relation to where Israeli forces were. And so all of us are learning and adapting to try to be better able to tell the stories that need to be told without the advantage of actually being on the ground, seeing them for ourselves.
Yes. Clarissa, the context of a war full of tragic moments, and actually this war is also occurring on social media. Let's talk about the viral video where the Egyptian activist Rahma was shooting at you and you remained very calm. What message did you take from this incident?
Well, I took a couple of really important messages. The first was that I understand. I lived in the Middle East for many years. I understood how upset people were. I understood that there was anger, frustration, rage, sadness, fear. And the protester who approached me, Rahma, made that very clear, and she articulated it very passionately. And my job as a journalist is not to be offended, is not to get into an argument with her about it, but rather to say, I hear you. I understand that a lot of people feel like you. And my job is to give you a platform. My job is to share your opinion and allow others around the world, particularly in the US and the West, to understand and feel the full force of what you're saying. I also understood in that moment, though, the full power of misinformation, because the first thing that Rahma said when she saw me was, "You're the actress," because there was a clip of me taking cover from rockets when I was on the ground in southern Israel right after October 7th. Somebody took the clip and they faked it to make it look like there was a director in New York telling me what to do and that there weren't any rockets. And this clip went viral, and it became a huge headache for me because people thought that I was pretending that I came under rocket fire. And so there was a lot of hatred and anger directed at me. Hatred and anger directed at me, it's not important, right? What's important is what's happening on the ground. But what it underscores is the difficulty of trying to do this job well and trying to do it fairly and trying to do it with dignity and with compassion when there is so much misinformation flying around.
And here, what do you think about the role of technology and social media in shaping the way the conflicts are reported and covered today?
I think on the one hand, social media has played a hugely important role. Were it not for social media, what would we be seeing from on the ground in Gaza? Who would be able to tell their stories? So, in terms of owning the narrative, I think it's really valuable that people now have the ability to tell their own stories. And I think it's incredibly powerful and compelling that you can no longer carry out a massacre in this day and age, and no one in the world's going to know about it. You know, when Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, carried out the massacres in Hama in Syria, people didn't see video of it. People understood, they heard whispers about it, but nobody except those who lived through it saw what actually happened. That's not the case anymore. There will always be someone with a cell phone. There will always be the potential for a video to go viral. And that's a hugely powerful thing. The problem becomes that people start to choose their own narratives, and they only want to live in the echo chamber or the bubble of that narrative. And they only want to hear facts and stories that resonate with their own narrative. And what I have learned from many years of doing this job in many different places is that you have to be open to other people's narratives, other people's perceptions of events, and the possibility that sometimes the facts are not exactly as you think they are. And that doesn't mean that you don't take a side or you don't have a conviction about what is right and what is wrong, or that you don't have your own values. But it does mean that it's hugely important in order to build tolerance and understanding and ultimately consensus and a pathway ahead, that you're willing to at least hear what other people have to say as well. And with social media, we don't do that. We demonize, we push people into their furthest corners, and we only hear what we want to hear.
Clarissa, how do you approach sourcing and verifying the truth? In this era, there's a lot of misinformation and propaganda, and especially in conflict zones.
It's very tricky. I have never worked in a conflict zone where this is not a problem. There is always going to be propaganda. There is always going to be misinformation. There are always going to be attempts made to trick journalists, to push forward one narrative over another. And sometimes we fall short, and sometimes we get things wrong, and sometimes people make mistakes. In my experience, the best thing to do when you're given some new information or you're given a big claim that's made by someone in a position of authority, sit for a second. Don't go straight on television or onto the internet and say this information. Sit and try to ascertain whether there is truth to it or not. Because Scott Pelley, who is a great journalist for 60 Minutes, I never forget, he told me once, Clarissa, no one remembers who was first. Everyone remembers who was wrong.
Sure.
Everyone remembers who was wrong. So, and we can't get it wrong. We're not in a position where we can afford to get it wrong. We've already lost the trust of a lot of people for a number of different reasons, some fair, some not fair. That's not the point. The point is we need to be focused on the future. We need to be focused on doing good journalism. And the only way to do good journalism is to systematically try to verify using multiple trusted sources every single piece of information that comes your way. No matter how much you might want to rush it onto air, and I don't need to tell you this, you work for النهار. You know this as well as I do,
We
Diana.
face
We
it.
face
But,
it.
it's always a challenge because you always want to get it out there and get it first. And really, it's more important to get it right.
Can you share a specific moment where you faced a conflict between your personal values and your responsibilities as a journalist?
I'm trying to think of a situation, a conflict between my personal values and my professional ethics. I think there were times when I was doing a lot of work in Syria, and I was spending a lot of time covering Western jihadists who had moved to northern Syria, some to join Jabhat al-Nusra, some to become aid workers, some to join Daesh, ISIS. And there are real moments where, in order to be a journalist, you have to build trust with somebody, right? You have to say, I'm going to be fair to you. I'm going to tell your story. But there is a fine line sometimes between building trust and trying to be friendly to someone so that they'll feel more comfortable around you, so that they're more likely to tell you their story. And so I had moments, I don't think I crossed any line, but I definitely had moments where I would stop myself and think, how do I approach this conversation? Am I friendly? Am I not friendly? Am I open? Am I not open? And ultimately, I felt that the best way to do it was to be as transparent as possible, and not friendly per se, but also not unfriendly, and very clear about what the boundaries were, very clear about not wanting to engage in certain kinds of conversations, because obviously a lot of the propaganda, especially that some of the very brainwashed
Yeah.
individuals would talk about, was, I'm not just going to put that on television just because they tell me that, right? It's about trying to dig deeper, peel back the layers, and understand what's really happening and where this kind of radicalism sort of came from. But I would say that that was as challenging as it gets ethically, in terms of knowing how to like walk the line, both as a human being, as a professional. But we're often in situations doing this work where, I've had times where someone needs help. Okay, do I keep doing my work or do I help the person? I'm really supposed to be there just to do my work, not to help. But sometimes I will just help because I'm a human being too. And I don't think it's the end of the day. It's the worst thing to be a human sometimes.
What advice would you give to aspiring journalists who aspire to report from conflict zones? And here, let's remember, we have like tens of victims between the journalists in Gaza.
No, I know. I mean, so many journalists have been killed in Gaza, and so many in Lebanon, by the way, covering this war. This war has been the deadliest war for journalists since they started making records. And so it's obviously not a decision that anyone should embark on lightly. It's not a game. It's not dramatic and exciting and like in a movie or something. It's incredibly challenging. It's incredibly painful. It's often very dangerous. And you are going to be confronted often with the worst of humanity. And you are going to be put into all sorts of situations that will really test you.
And no one will protect you. Unfortunately.
Yeah, people will have the best of intentions to say that they will protect you, but at the end of the day, when you're at the tip of the spear, yeah, you're there maybe with your team, and that's it. and you have each other. And so what I always say to people who want to do this job is you have to want to do it for the right reasons. You have to really feel passionate about it. You have to be willing to like humble yourself and the ideas you have about the world, and be open to other cultures and other societies, and listen to them and learn from them, and realize that maybe you're not the best thing in the entire world, and that's okay. So there's a degree of humility that I really think is important for young journalists to approach it with. At the same time, if you have that fire in your belly and you feel that sense of calling, I really think there is no greater job. And yes, you see the worst of humanity, but you also see the best of humanity. You also see the courage and the resilience and extraordinary small acts of kindness that are so profoundly moving when they are set against the backdrop of horror and violence and sadness.
Clarissa Ward, Chief International Correspondent for CNN, much appreciate. Thank you very much for joining النهار in this episode.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.